Hello, Dr. Jima. I am Jared Sharp here to discuss the Native American literary unit that I chose to do my presentation about exploring the realistic reservations of Sherman Alexie. And let's start by talking about a brief overview. He was a very successful author, screenplay writer, and filmmaker with the Signals movie that we had the opportunity to watch. He also introduced many people to life and the culture of Indian reservations. It certainly was news to me. Being able to just be immersed in their culture, it's kind of similar to watching like Black Panther or something like that, where reading this book really brings you into an entirely new world, a new environment that's very different, very unfamiliar, but also I was able to quickly see that he was a very skilled and talented writer, which leads me to my next point. He was extremely talented. He was very much respected for his contributions to the literary culture, but he was also a very flawed man, as he had some misdealings with women that we will discuss later in the presentation. So, moving along to his early life, he was born with certain issues that he had. He started with a condition, I believe it was hydrocephalus, is how you pronounce it, which is excess fluid in the brain. And this led to him getting brain surgery at the age of being only 6 months old. He wasn't expected to survive. And in other books, he talks about how it was vulnerable for him growing up with that condition and being picked on because people knew he had an ailment. But through all of that, you see resilience, a thing that we'll talk about on the next slide. Resilience of overcoming. In spite of that, by the age of 3, he knew how to read. And he mentions that reading education and writing literature very early on was just kind of an escape from the harsh realities of being poor on an Indian reservation. And um, even though he had his mom and his dad in his life, he had a very fractured relationship with his mother. He had very deep mother wounds, and these wounds never healed all the way up until his mother passed away. I'd like to share an excerpt that is from his book where he talks about the moment that his mother died. And I quote, "I was not at my mother's side when she took her last breath. I was home in Seattle waiting for word of her death. My sister texted, 'She's gone.' I collapsed with grief, but to tell the difficult truth, I was also collapsed with relief. I assumed I'd be freed from my mother and her endless accusations, falsehoods, exaggerations, and deceptions. Now, if that's not a complicated relationship, quite frankly, I don't know what is. But through it all, it leads me to my first point, which is resilience. Just him being a success in general is shows a ton of resilience. He found a way to thrive despite having a broken relationship with his father, despite almost his entire immediate family, all his brothers and sisters were alcoholics. I learned this from listening to him talk about this in a YouTube video that can be found in the works cited page of the essay that accompanies this presentation. But going back to Alexie, just him being a success and making it out of the reservation to live a semblance of a normal life and not put his children through the same things that he went through is a testament to resilience. And also, I love the story of James in the book. When the baby, and I believe it's chapter 5. No, it's not chapter 5. I struggle to recall what chapter it is, but there's a chapter about the baby James and his parents die in a fire, and the narrator takes him in. And at first, it feels like you're in for a bumpy ride, but what's cool to see is you see the maturation of the narrator. You see him, get a girlfriend. You see him overcome addiction and stop drinking and become a parent, albeit things were rough. But the character matures and gives James a family and loves him despite his issues with being mute and unable to speak. And then you also have an addiction, which the addiction stories They felt authentic because they were, as I mentioned. Alexie himself was an alcoholic at one point, and he came from a family of alcoholics, which allowed him to talk about it much easier in a much more natural, authentic way than most people. And also, what stood out to me is just kind of the doom and gloom of alcoholism. I don't recall seeing the word redemption whatsoever when reading this book. And it was just really strange to me because when you read the story about the basketball player Silas Sirius, now this was in chapter 5, they talk about how much, he's nearly a hero. They talk about him in such a positive light, about he's such a great basketball player. And the moment, the very second they find out that he has a drinking problem, his hopes and dreams are just completely shattered. And now he's the same as everyone else on the reservation with no hope of being successful. And that's troubling to say the least. But, again, when addiction has pull on a community like that, I can only imagine the shortcomings that are present. And I'd like to just talk about a couple of observations I got from watching the movie based on the book, Smoke Signals. First thing I noticed is that the visuals felt oddly familiar when I was watching it and I was seeing like what the reservation looked like and what Victor would look like. Even I believe when the movie opens, the first time you see Victor and Thomas builds a fire, you see them as children very early in the movie. And as soon as I see them, I'm like, yep, based on the actions of those characters that I read about in the book, I knew exactly who everyone was before the plot began, before the movie explained who these characters were or what their relationship was. And that's a testament to how talented Alexie was in terms of describing the book. And also, one thing I really enjoy about the way that this book is written, unlike a lot of authors, Alexi paints the picture without giving a ton of detail. Instead of telling you that this is bad, this is terrible, he just presents the information to you in a natural, creative way and allows you to kind of put it together yourself what the environment is like, and you come to your own conclusion whether or not something is bad, as that's a relative term. And so I appreciated that about the book. And another thing that I struggled with was just the storytelling. I can understand, the culture of having some kind of special element to your stories, but in watching the movie, by the time I reached a point where Victor is talking to the girlfriend of his deceased father, and she's telling him about stories that his dad told her, he's like, well, my dad lied. And at that point, I was just kind of fed up because I was just thinking to myself, why is it that everyone has to lie about all of the stories? I don't understand. Like, what do they need to front for? They're all, from the same place, similar background. What's the point in telling exaggerated lies and stories? Even looking at it from a different perspective, you have a movie, and in the movie, the entire movie is basically one flashback after another about Indians telling exaggerated stories. And this is a movie based on a book that was written about the exaggerated stories, written by a person who is an Indian who very likely tells exaggerated stories himself. And so I came to the conclusion that this is basically a theme that there's no escaping. So but I still appreciated the art. And so to sum it all up, um, Sherman Alexie had a lot of ups and downs. He was very successful, highly appreciated. As we're studying him in this very class, is proof of how his art have has stood the test of time and how valuable his art is to the literary culture. And he had some downs as well, as in 2018, 1 year after his autobiography novel, he had 3 women come forward and accuse him of sexual misconduct. One of those women even alleged that she knew stories of at least 20 other women who had similar things to say as the women who came forward. They all had similar stories about how he would try to court them and greet them as young Indian female authors, and how he would use his fame to get close to them and really make sexual advances. And that's really alarming. That's really inappropriate. And that's really disturbing. But at the same time, I come from the mind state of only God can judge a person. I cannot. And the man was never charged for anything that he did. And he did admit to doing some wrongdoing, and he did publicly apologize for his actions that he caused to some of these women who were saying things about him. So while I don't excuse it, I don't think that's appropriate under any circumstance. He was never charged, and he's still reasonably celebrated. And after he went through that experience, he kind of took a step back from the public eye, but he still does small events and outings, particularly in the Seattle, Washington area, as he's been a celebrity figure there for quite some time. This photo here, I actually took it from his Instagram, and it was posted, I believe, on May 1st or May 2nd, 2025. So this is the most recent photo of him that I could find, still being out and still having the art that he created appreciated. And so, with that being said, regardless of how I or anyone else may feel about his transgressions, I think that the excellence that he's given the world through literature is undeniable. And, in spite of his issues, I don't feel convicted about reading his art, as, we are all faulted in one way or another. And with that, that will conclude my presentation on the Native American Literary Unit.